Well, we are continuing to look at this important section of Deuteronomy, laws on loving the neighbor. And we looked at a series of laws that I roughly grouped together in terms of loving regard for the neighbor's life. And now we're looking at a series of laws that I'm approximating under the title of loving the neighbor's purity. And so these laws roughly are united by the theme of purity, and we might notice that in Deuteronomy 22 at verse 5. I had said, I'm sure you all remember because you hang on my every word, I had said that one of the ways of thinking about purity as we find it in these chapters is not mixing things together that should not be mixed. And so we see a good illustration of that in verse 5 of chapter 22. A woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. That may be regarded as a somewhat timely verse instead of an irrelevant verse. And the purpose clearly is not to mix gender identities. Now, sometimes it's not so clear exactly how this should be interpreted. There was a time earlier in the 20th century when several people would have appealed to that verse to say that women should never wear pants. That was a violation of Deuteronomy 22:5. Well, of course, Deuteronomy 22:5 doesn't say a woman can't wear pants. It's that there should not be an effort to blur the distinction between the genders. That would be a mixing that leads to impurity. And I think we can see that that continues to be an important point. And the law clearly is not just not mixing cloaks of one that's a feminine cloak and one that's a masculine cloak. It's a call to meditate on gender identity altogether. So thinking about gender identity is not a brand new thing. It's not something discovered in the 21st century. And this verse also doesn't answer every question, but it does answer the essential point that the Bible says that God created them, male and female, and that distinction is to be maintained and preserved. It's part of the purity of living, the not mixing in living to which we're called. And then we're not going to be able to go verse by verse through all of this, but I want to try to take some somewhat representative verses, and I find the next law somewhat intriguing, verses 6 and 7. If you come across a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall let the mother go, but the young you may take for yourself, that it may go well with you and you may live long. Now that's peculiar, isn't it? If you're writing a covenant constitution for a church or for a nation, what is the likelihood you're going to have a section on bird nests? I mean, this just is the kind of thing that leads people to scratch their heads and say, what is going on in Deuteronomy? And I'm not sure exactly what's going on here, but we have a little clue, don't we, at the end of verse 7, that you may live long. Now, we had a professor at our seminary who, when he was teaching a class to students, would occasionally stop and say, I'm thinking of a verse. Can you anticipate the verse I'm thinking of? And my sons who sat in his class said that it was really stimulating because he knew a lot of obscure verses, and very often they could not figure out what he was thinking of. But this is not an obscure reference, is it? This is the fifth commandment. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land your God is giving you. There's an echo of the fifth commandment here. And I'm not sure all of what's going on, but somehow even mother birds are to be regarded. And part of what's going on here, I think, is that if we stop and ponder this, and again, this isn't given to be speed read. There's little profit to the speed reading of Deuteronomy. If we pause and ponder it, there's nothing in life that is insignificant. You know what the word significant means? It has meaning. There are more important things and less important things. Moses is not saying bird nests are one of the most important things in life. But he is saying everything has significance. Everything is related to the purpose of God. Even if we're out gardening or gathering eggs or looking at birds, it all has a significance in the purpose of God. And in this situation, what he, I think, is sort of saying is when you see a mother bird sitting on its eggs or taking care of its young, it should make you think of family. It should make you think of God's provision of family for his people. It should make you think of your obligation to honor your father and your mother. And so don't go in and kill the mother and the young. Don't go in and kill the mother and take the eggs. Spare the mother to produce more eggs, to produce more young. I mean, there's a practical element here. You don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's a sort of related principle. And so at each of these laws, there is a remarkable principle hiding underneath that encourages us to be thoughtful about life, to be concerned about life. Then there are the obvious practical laws. Verse 8, when you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof. This is not a universal law. It does not mean you have to build a fence around every roof. If you're living in North Dakota and you have a very pitched roof, so the snow will fall off and no one is ever going to have a party on that pitched roof, you don't have to build a fence. But if you're in Israel and you're building a house with a flat roof, as most of them did, and that flat roof becomes part of the living space of the home, then you need to build a fence around it so people won't fall off the roof. This is very practical, but it's also showing love for the neighbor, isn't it? You should be enough concerned about how you manage your property that you don't have dangerous things on your property that's going to harm your neighbor. And so there's a practicality there. And then there are things I can't explain to you. Verse 9, you shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, lest the whole yield be forfeited. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe a farmer could explain to me. It's probably very inefficient to plant two crops together. They'll mature at different times. It'll be difficult to harvest them. So there may be something practical here, but probably a farmer doesn't need to be told that. He probably knows that. But what we can see, even without necessarily being able to explain it all, is this is another problem of mixing. Don't mix what shouldn't be mixed. I think sometimes the mixing, the next verse, you shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. Now again, I don't know if that's inefficient. I don't know enough about the relative sizes of oxen and donkey. Maybe the yoke would be tipped and the poor donkey would have more of the weight and it would all be inefficient and the rows wouldn't be, I don't know. But what is clear is, from all sorts of perspectives, Moses is saying, don't mix what ought not to be mixed. It leads to problems. It leads to difficulties. Now, verse 11, I can explain to you, I think. You shall not wear cloth of wool and linen mixed together. I would like to say this shirt is 100% cotton, but I'm not sure about the jacket. So I'm not sure whether I'm keeping the law or not. Are we obligated to wear clothing that is only made out of one fabric? Is that what this law is teaching? I don't think so. Because the specification is wool and linen. And then if we know our Bibles well, We know that in Exodus 26 and 28, we're told that the curtains of the tabernacle will be woven of wool and linen together, and the garments of the priest will be woven of wool and linen together. And so I think what Moses is saying here, don't presume to be wearing holy garments. Don't be decking yourselves as if you were priests. Don't be wearing clothes that are part of the holy furnishings of the tabernacle. Don't mix your common life with the holy life of the tabernacle. So, even these strange things have a meaning for the people of God and are a call to ponder purity. You shall make yourself tassels on the four corners of the garments with which you cover yourself. Now that too is not a new law. That's a reminder of what we read in Numbers 15, 38 and 39. Speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner, and it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord to do them. So these tassels, again, are not just an arbitrary act of obedience. I mean, if the Lord wanted arbitrary acts of obedience, we should still be obedient. But it's not arbitrary. It's to be a reminder. You're to look down. It doesn't say all garments, but outer garments. So I ought to have tassels if I were under the Mosaic economy, hanging down, so that when I look down, I would see the tassels and it would remind me of the commandments of God. And if you see Orthodox Jewish men, almost always you will see that they are wearing a prayer cloth of white and blue, and there are tassels at the bottom of that prayer cloth with a blue tassel hanging down, and they wear it to remind themselves of the commandments of God. And so all of this, you see, has a purpose. All of it has a function. Now, we've talked about Deuteronomy as a whole being a chiasm. I think if we had more time and energy, we could see there's a chiasm to the laws of God in this section, and there's also something of a chiasm here. As I say, I hope others will be able to do more with the structure of Deuteronomy. But if there's a chiasm here in the laws of love to the neighbor, then that means there's a center, a crucial center element of that chiasm on loves of the neighbor. And I think we come to it here at Deuteronomy 22:13 and following, which are laws concerning sexual immorality. So there are all kinds of laws about purity, but for the people of God, sexual purity is particularly important. And so that's what's turned to here. And what is focused on, again, is a series of specific illustrations of what sexual purity ought to look like. And that includes the way a wife is to be treated if her husband loses interest in her. It's an illustration of how adulterers are to be treated. And again, there's an equality here. Both the man and the woman are to be executed if they're guilty of adultery. So that too in the ancient world would have been very unique, that men and women were treated in equal terms. You may say equally harshly, but what God is saying is that the life of the family and the sexual fidelity of husband and wife are a reflection of the relationship between God and his people. And that's still said in the New Testament, isn't it? In Ephesians 5, Paul makes that point very strongly. The relationship of husband and wife is a reflection of the relationship of Christ and the church. And that's why part of the reason that the stress on sexual fidelity is so very stressed. It's an essential part of purity. And those who are relatively indifferent to their spouse are likely to be indifferent to their God. And that's the point being stressed here. That's why there's the call to reflect on this. and to think about it. And there's even maybe some instruction for the Me Too movement. It says if an engaged woman is raped in the countryside, only the man who rapes her is to be executed, because it will be assumed that she cried out for help and resisted. But if she's raped in the city and doesn't cry out for help, then they're both executed. So there has to be resistance, and where there is resistance, the woman should be honored and the man punished. So there's really an exalting of human relationships and of women in a profound sense here in these passages. Now, one thing that might strike us, and is certainly true, is that as we look at these laws, and particularly these laws governing sexual purity and divorce and adultery and rape, that the attention seems to be very much on the external actions and very little on the internal feelings. You may have thought that, you're all too polite to say so, but you may have thought that when we talked about the woman captured after a battle and she's beautiful and the Israelite man wants to marry her, so he marries her. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of feelings in this relationship. There's not a lot of romance. There's no record of dating or candlelight dinners, or and we might wonder about that. I think a lot of what's going on here is talking about the external purity, the surface purity of Israel in distinguishing it from the world. It's not a denial that feelings matter or that feelings are significant, but it's not the point here. And the point here is that Israel is called to exemplify to the world a separate life, a pure life, an unmixed life before the world. And so it's very much the externals that are largely being focused on. Now, that's not 100% true. It's interesting if we were to look over to Deuteronomy 24, verse 5, it says, "When a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be liable for any other public duty. He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with his wife whom he has taken." So there's a moment of looking at attitudes and relationships and seeing that they're more than just the external purity. But a big focus here is on the visible purity and reality. It's not an encouraging of hypocrisy. It's not an encouraging of a lack of emotion or affection. We'll see towards the end, there is a summary statement that all of this is to be done out of love for God and the neighbor, but it is focusing on what it should look like to people on the outside looking hard at what is going on. So the call to treating the neighbor with purity, especially the call to sexual purity. And then we can see at the end of this, verse 30 of chapter 22 of Deuteronomy, "A man shall not take his father's wife so that he does not uncover his father's nakedness." Paul seems to appeal to this, doesn't he, in 1 Corinthians 5, where he's talking about not marrying a mother or a stepmother, that this would be a violation of the proper maintenance of relationships in a family. And so these laws are appealed to in a variety of ways in the New Testament, that our sexual ethics and our family relationships are kept pure in a proper way. And then, having talked in somewhat general ways about sexual purity, he goes on to talk about, in chapter 23, at both purity in the gathered assembly at the tabernacle, and then purity in the camp beyond the tabernacle. And again, these things are somewhat remarkable. Perhaps having thought about sexual purity, the beginning of purity in the assembly is suggested And verse 23, verse 1 says, "No one whose testicles are crushed or whose male organ is cut off shall enter the assembly of the Lord." Have you heard a sermon on that text? It made me think of a line in an Agatha Christie novel where a servant is being interviewed by the police after a crime, and the servant says, "Oh, he spoke terrible words, worse even than in the Bible." This is a woman who's clearly been raised in Victorian England and knows what words are improper and is constantly being shocked by the reading of the Bible. She's clearly looking for a Victorian edition of the Bible. And it's interesting, we can still be a little bit shocked. But here is a call to people entering the court of Israel outside the tabernacle to worship God who are in a state of purity and who are not in some way or other disqualified for entering. And again, this is not to say that these people are subhuman or that they are beyond the love or affection of God, but again, there's this surface qualification for whom may draw near to the Lord, and a variety of disqualifying impurities then are listed. No one born of a forbidden union. That is, God has forbidden certain kinds of marriages, and if you're a child of that marriage, you may not enter the assembly to the 10th generation. Again, this is an external purity being maintained. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. Forever, they are excluded. Why is that? Because these are two tribes that sought to prevent Israel from entering the promised land. And those who sought to keep Israel out of the promised land will never be permitted to enter the tabernacle. Now, that's not to say they are forever excluded from being in covenant with God, from becoming part of God's people. But again, there's the impurity, that the visible purity that is being maintained in the tabernacle. And then it goes on to say, Egyptians can come in, but only after the 3rd generation. So you see the distinctions that are being made. If you try to keep us out of the promised land, you could never come in. If you held us as a slave, you have to wait 3 generations. If you're a product of a forbidden marriage, then you have to wait enough. Everything is being specified to make us all think about, what does purity look like? What purity is required? What separation does there need to be in order to be qualified? Again, not because it disqualifies from salvation individuals, but because it gives expression to the appearance, the mirror that Israel presents to the world of what the people of God are supposed to look like. Now we can see over and over again, Israel doesn't live up to all these things. Israel constantly fails to be the mirror that it's called to be. But here is this reality placed before them that they're called to holiness. And then this holiness of the tabernacle and the court of Israel is then extended to the whole camp. The camp is to be holy, and there are specific corruptions of the camp that are talked about, like the lady in the Agatha Christie. I'm not going to read that; it's just too gross. But what it says very interestingly is the Lord walks through the camp and should not be offended by seeing anything unclean. Now, it's an interesting idea. You know, the Lord presumably is offended by uncleanness wherever he sees it in the world. But there's something special about his people. There's something special about the camp where his tabernacle is in the center. There's a special relationship between God and his people. That's all of what's being talked about here and what's being laid out here, and why it has to be clean, why it has to be protected and separated from impurity. So the Lord, as we're seeing as we come to a close of this part of Deuteronomy, the Lord is seeking in so many different ways, relationships between neighbors, relationships in families, relationships in worship and in the camp that is moving towards the promised land. In all these places, the Lord will have his people pure and have his people living out of love to one another so that purity will speak to the world about the presence of God and the work of God and the saving accomplishment of God. Thank you.